we're doing a series. We're doing a series called How Do You Turn a Setback into a Comeback? And we've talked a little bit about business and a business setback, and we've talked a little bit about life, and we're going to talk today about setbacks that aren't our fault. I don't mind having a setback that's my fault. One that I know I caused, one that I know that I had the problem with, and it was my fault to begin with. But what about those setbacks that come along that aren't your fault? Now each message that we've picked somebody out in the Bible, and we've looked at how they've handled the particular issue. And so today we're going to look at something that was caused by somebody else's decision, by somebody else's mistake, by somebody else's sin. And we're going to look at what happens when we're the innocent party that gets hurt by somebody else's decision. Now, let me just say this. If you've been deeply hurt by somebody else, if your life has been impacted to the negative by somebody else, you know exactly what I'm talking about today. Maybe right now you're dealing with a setback or you're paying the price of a divorce you didn't want, or a business that was bought out and your job became irrelevant. And that wasn't your plan. You showed up for work every day. Or maybe your company went bankrupt and you're feeling that. Maybe you struggle with an identity because your parents sent you mixed messages growing up, and your emotions are all over the place, and your physical health is messed up because some bad person abused you, a person in a position of authority who abused you and messed you up. And I grieve with you, and I grieve for you because that's been done for you. And even though somebody else brought all that stuff onto your life and into your life, it sure affects us. It affects you. It affects your health. It affects your emotions. It affects your happiness. And I want to look at what happens in that kind of setback today. And then I want to see how God uses those and helps us turn those into comebacks. And we're going to go out of Acts chapter 27. That's what I want to base this on, Acts chapter 27. And because in Acts 27 is a very dramatic example of how often we suffer, how we often suffer from the foolish choices of other people. Now here's the deal. Paul, let me give you some background. Paul always had a dream of going to Rome to preach the gospel. Paul wanted to go preach the gospel to the city of Rome. You say, why did Paul want to go to Rome to preach? Here's why. Rome is the Washington, D.C. of the day. I mean, everything big happened in Rome. Everything, it was the power base was Rome. It was where it was where the money was. It was where the decisions were made. It was where everything could be impacted across the world happened in Rome. And it was the capital of Italy. It was the capital of the Roman Empire. It was like Washington, D.C. It's where all the power brokers felt. Our country, we sometimes forget just how powerful of a nation we are until we go abroad. We go and see what it's like in other countries, and we see that when they give their news every day and they talk about their economy, they base their economy on the dollar. There are nations outside of the United States. Ecuador is one of those nations that doesn't have their own currency. They use the U.S. dollar for their currency. And so we have that kind of a situation where Paul wanted to go where the power was. Paul wanted to go where the power base was. And he wanted to preach the gospel in the Colosseum. And God says, I've got different plans. I want you to go to Rome, but I don't want you to go to Rome as a preacher. I want you to go to Rome as a prisoner. And so God said, here's how I'm going to do it. And he had Paul unfairly charged with a crime and put on trial. He hadn't committed the crime, but he was charged with the crime. And because he was a Roman citizen, he had the right of an appeal. So he was able to appeal directly to Caesar. And he used that appeal to get to Rome. In fact, he was able to go to Rome on a free ticket. So that's where we're going to pick up the story there, because Paul has been put on a ship along with some other prisoners in an island called Crete, which is out in the Mediterranean. And he's headed for Rome, and the ship is docked in the port in Crete, and they've been there for a while, and it's autumn, and it's turning into winter, and conventional wisdom says you don't sail in the Mediterranean Sea in the wintertime. It's notorious for storms and bad weather, and God says to Paul, you go tell that captain that he needs to stay put. He doesn't need to move. You tell that captain he needs to stay right where he is And if he leaves, there's going to be a storm that blows up, and bad things are going to happen. And so Paul did exactly what God told him to do. Paul warned the captain. He said, don't leave this port. But the captain was impatient, and he asked the crew who were impatient. Now, I'm sitting here thinking, well, why in the world did the crew get impatient? Because if they left the port, they'd have to work. If they're in port, they're not really doing much work. They're hanging around. And that, here's why they were impatient to go. How many of you guys ever been on an airplane that backed away from the gate at the airport and just sat there for a while? Raise your hand if that's ever been you. All right. You know why the pilot backed away? Because they don't get paid until they leave that gate. So the whole time they back away from that gate, now they're on the clock. As long as they stay attached to the gate, they're not on the clock. So they pull out from the gate because at that point they start getting paid. All right, the sailors were the same way back then. They didn't get paid until the boat left the port. So while they're in Crete, they're not really enjoying anything. They're not making any money. So they're going, you know what? We need to get paid. Let's push out. There seems to be a favorable wind. So let's get going. Let's get on the road. And they sailed right into a massive storm. Look at what happened. Acts chapter 27, verse 41. The ship struck a reef and ran aground. As it was repeatedly smashed by the force of the storm's wave, the ship began to break apart. Now imagine asking yourself, what does this story have to do with me on March the 3rd, 2019? What is the story about leaving an island in the Mediterranean Sea and getting shipwrecked? What does this have to do with me? Plenty. If you'll bear with me in this, it's going to answer three very important questions about your life. First, what causes people to make bad decisions that affect us? And that's covered. The second is, what do we need to know when we're in the middle of a storm caused by somebody else's bad decisions that aren't our fault? We're going to look at that. The third thing we need to know is what we need to remember when we're in a storm that's wrecking our ship and we feel hopeless. So let's take a look at them, okay? And that, number one, what causes people to make bad decisions that causes setback and storms for other people? Number one is this. It's when we listen to ungodly advice. That's what causes people to make bad decisions that cause trouble in everybody else's life. It's when we listen to ungodly advice. Acts chapter 27, verse 9 and 10, it said, much time had been lost, and the day of fasting had passed, so by now it had become dangerous to sail because of the fall weather. So Paul warned the sailors with this advice, men, I have perceived that our voyage is going to be disastrous, and if we sail now, we'll lose the cargo, we'll lose the ship, and likely we'll lose our own lives too. But the Roman officer in charge of the prisoners didn't listen to Paul. Instead, he followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Okay, let's look at this. Anybody here ever been given bad advice? Raise your hand if you've ever been given bad advice. All right, lots of people have been given bad advice. All right. Anybody here ever been overruled by an expert? We've had folks that overruled by an expert, okay? Have the experts in your life ever been wrong? Sure, experts have been wrong. I've noticed some people, you've noticed some, I've got a name that comes to my mind right now, that I've noticed that whenever they wanted to do something, what would happen is they would get an answer, they'd get something in their mind they wanted to do, and they'd go around and they'd ask 18 or 20 different people, here's what I want to do, and what do you think? And they would go and go and go until they got the one that agreed with them. And, they would ask all these different people, and whenever they got a disagreement, they'd go someplace else. And they'd go to another person, and they'd go to another person, and they'd go to another person, until they finally found the one that validated what they wanted to do. And once they found that guy, that's the one they stuck with. They really didn't want advice. He didn't really want advice. He just wanted somebody to reinforce what he was already going to do. So here's the deal. Let's just be smart for a minute, all right? Let's just think smart for a minute. When God says, stay away from something, the best thing we can do is stay away, even when the experts tell us something different. If God says no, the answer will never be yes. So the first is when we listen to the experts. The first reason why bad things happen, and we get caught in the crossfire of that, is when we listen to bad advice. The second reason people sail into storms and shipwreck their lives is this. It's when we copy the crowd. We copy the crowd. When we say, you know what? Everybody's doing this. We're all doing this stuff. Verse 12. Then the crew decided that they should go ahead and sail up the coast of Crete because the majority, I want you to circle that, because the majority wanted to spend the winter in Phoenix and it had a nice harbor. And that's an interesting place to go. Because, right now we live in the United States of America, and a good half of the United States, the northern half, would love nothing more to do than to spend the winter in Phoenix. Not the same Phoenix, all right? Our Phoenix is in the desert. Their Phoenix had a harbor to it. So here's the deal. History shows how often the majority is often wrong. In the Bible, it tells us that on this ship there were 276 people. And the vote to stay or go was 273 to 3. Paul had a couple of people on the ship with him. And so do you think Paul, after the vote, after he was voted down, do you think Paul thought, you know what, this ain't going to be pretty? I imagine Paul thought this is going to be a recipe for disaster. Let me tell you a true story about this. I wasn't feeling very good the other day, and when I don't feel very good, I try to take a hot bath. So I was taking a hot bath. We have a cat, and I saw that cat's head pop up on the side of the bathtub and look at me. Now we got a window that's on the other side of the bathtub, and that cat jumped up to the window and sat looking at birds on the outside, and then decided to come back down. And I said to Dina, "This is not going to end well." When I was a youth minister, I asked a bunch of kids one time, "What did you learn this week?" And one little girl said to me, "I've learned that you should never try to baptize a cat." And I remembered that about that time that cat decided to make his jump. I guess it was Friday. That cat decided to make his jump, to try to get back into the bathroom. And as Maxwell Smart used to say in that show, Get Smart, he missed it by that much. And for a brief second or two, I was sharing the bathtub with a mad cat in there, all right? Now, here's the deal. I said to Dina, "This ain't going to end well." And you know what, folks? That didn't end well. We had a wet, mad cat running around the house. Now, that wasn't pretty. Paul says this isn't going to be pretty. Now, let me ask you a question. Can you think of anybody who shipwrecked their life because they followed the crowd? Do you know anybody that's made a mess of their life because they followed what everybody else was doing? And then the third reason people make decisions that have disastrous consequences for innocent people is we count on circumstances instead of Christ. When we count on circumstances instead of Christ, we're going to have setbacks. We're going to run into the storm when we count on our circumstances. Because just because it looks good at the moment doesn't mean it's good. Acts 27:13 says this: "When a gentle wind began to blow from the south, the crew thought they'd obtained what they wanted, and their plan would work. So they pulled up the anchor, and they sailed as close as possible to the shoreline of Crete." Okay, let me ask a question. Have you ever thought that you were getting exactly what you wanted, but then later on realized you were sailing head first right into the middle of the worst storm you've ever seen in your life? Because it just looked so perfect. Yeah, let me ask you another question. Do you think it's possible that everything you really might want in life just might be setting you up for the shipwreck? You see, when we pay attention to the circumstances, we stop listening to God. Have you ever heard this justification? Well, it just seemed right. It just seemed perfect at the time. That's bad logic. That's not logic. That's emotional. And I've noticed that when people actually get what they think they want, they find out it's never as good as they thought it was going to be. So why should I never trust my circumstances? Here's why. Because circumstances change continuously. Let's look at Acts 27:14. I just want to focus on the first three words of the verse. But shortly after they had made the decision to ignore what God told them to do, to ignore what God had said to them, shortly afterward, the weather changed suddenly. When I went to bed last night, 67 degrees. When I got up this morning, it was 61 degrees. When I left the house to come to church, it was considerably colder. Suddenly, a wind of hurricane force came out of the northeast and blew the ship out to sea. Oh, was that great theologian Tom Hanks in the movie Apollo 13 said, Houston, we've got a problem. The plan was we're going to hug Crete, and we're going to let that buffer anything that comes along. But then comes this big gale force wind, and now they are blown out into the sea, and they're at the mercy of the storm. Now the next thing we need to learn is, what do I need to know about storms? Because now we're in one. And it's not our fault, but we're in one. So here we are, and we're being blown around. And what do I need to know? Because if we don't know what storms will do to us, we need to know those storms will manipulate us. And let me give you 3 traps that those storms cause in our lives, and they're all found in Acts 27. Number 1, storms cause us to drift from our goals. Verse 15. The ship was caught up in the storm, and the wind was so strong they couldn't sail against it. They lost all control, so they stopped trying. They gave up, and they let the wind drive them, drifting in every direction. Okay, that verse is what's called packed with insight. I want you to look at it again, and I want you to notice 5 ways that a setback can unconsciously dominate us. He says that in a storm, number 1, we tend to lose control of our plan. You know, we got this plan. This is how my life's going to work out. We've got this plan. And then the storm comes, and all of a sudden we don't have that plan anymore. It's out of control. It's out of our control. We're not in control anymore. And when we lose control, it says the second thing was they stopped trying because they're tired of fighting. They're tired of fighting the wind. They're tired of fighting the waves. They're tired of fighting the boss. They're tired of fighting their husband. They're tired of fighting their wives. They're tired of fighting. And so they just quit. And then the third says they gave up. Fourth, it says that they got driven by pressure instead of being driven with a reason. Instead of having a purpose for having driven out there, they become driven by pressure. He said, we let the wind just blow us wherever it went. And number 5, it says they drifted in every direction. That's what happens when we find ourselves in a storm. Because at that point, the voice inside of us says, why are you even trying? You're not getting anywhere. This isn't worth the effort. And these are the things that come when we find ourselves in the storms. Now, let me get real personal about this for a second, okay? In fact, let me stop talking about Acts and start talking about us, okay? Because have you ever let a storm, or you ever let a setback cause you to lose your focus? And all of a sudden, the main thing isn't the main thing anymore? And all of a sudden, what's important has changed? See, in storms, we try to control the uncontrollable. Verse 17. Then the crew tied ropes around the ship to try to hold it together. All right, this is a huge storm. That's what we know. It's a huge storm. And they get these giant ropes because the ship's being hit so much that it's starting to come apart. And so they take these ropes and they tie them underneath the boat, and they're going to try to hold the boat together with these ropes. By the way, this storm had lasted 2 weeks. We're not talking about an overnighter here, okay? We're talking about hurricane force winds for 2 solid weeks. And they'd been fighting these things. They were scared. They were tired. They were seasick. They were defeated. The boat was coming apart underneath them, so they're tying ropes underneath it to try to keep it together. And here's a good point for me to ask another personal question, because if we're in the storm and we're falling apart, we tend to try to tie ropes around us to keep it together, only our ropes have names like alcohol or sex or drugs. As we tie those ropes around us to try to keep us together. And what kind of ropes do we use when it's falling apart? Second, storms can cause me to discard what I used to value. In other words, our priorities and our values change when we've had a setback. For instance, if you've had a long-term illness, you look at health totally differently than you did before. In verses 18 and 19 of Acts 27, it says this: the next day, all right, this is a 2-week storm, as the gale force winds continue to batter the ship, the crew begin throwing all the cargo overboard. The following day, they even throw out all the ship's equipment and anything else they could lay their hands on. I want you to notice the progression of this. All right, they start throwing out cargo because they're trying to lighten the ship up. And then they throw out the equipment that they need to run the ship. Later on in the story, they get ready to jump and swim. See, storms not only cause me to drift, but they cause me to discard, and we start throwing stuff away, and it's stuff that we just may need somewhere down the road. Never make a major decision when you're in the middle of a storm, because it's going to be the wrong decision, and the stuff we discard just may be the stuff that we need once we get out of the storm. And then number 3, storms can cause me to despair. Acts 27:20 says this: "This terrible storm raged unabated for many days, blotting out both the sun and the stars." They haven't seen the sun. They haven't seen the sky for 2 weeks. Now, when you can't see the sun and you can't see the stars and you're out on the ocean and you have no compass and you have no idea where you are, blotting out the sun and the stars until in the dark, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They threw out the cargo. They threw out the necessities. They tried to bind the ship together. They threw out everything they could. They discarded. They drifted. But the very last thing they gave up was hope. You know, hope's always the last thing to go. In our lives, hope is always the last thing to go. Now, the amazing part of this story is that Luke's with him, but they're all describing everybody else. But you look at Paul during this, and Paul's anything but like that. Paul's reaction is totally different. Everybody else is panicked. Paul's confident. You know, I've been privileged to be a preacher for a long time. I've watched a lot of people go through setbacks. And I've discovered that the true test of a mature faith isn't how high you jump when you sing praises to God. It's how straight you walk when you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death. I have discovered that the storm that wasn't Paul's fault, that the storm that wasn't because Paul had been disobedient, that the storm that Paul hadn't done anything wrong, that the storm they were in, that they had ignored Paul's advice on, that the storm, while everybody else thinks they're going to die, Paul is at peace. And you ask, what is his secret? And when you face a setback, here's where we need to remember the 3 things that Paul remembered while he was at peace, while they were falling apart. Number 1, when you're in the storm, remember that God is with me. He has not left me. God's not abandoned us. Acts chapter 27, 21 through 23 says this: "Finally, Paul called their crew together." I like this because you know what? There are times when I'm having a discussion with somebody over advice I've given that they ignored, and it's not good manners to go, "I told you so," right? Not good manners to do that? Okay, maybe it is good manners. Look at Paul. Finally, Paul called their crew together and said, "Men, if you'd listened to me," oh, I told you so, "you would have avoided all of this injury and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your life, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the God I serve and belong stood by me." So remember that God is with us. He's not left us. The second thing is, remember God's purpose is greater than my storm. His purpose is greater than any storm that we're going to go through. Acts chapter 27, verse 24. God's angel said to me, "Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will certainly stand before Caesar. God in his goodness has granted safety to anyone else sailing with you." Okay, do you get that? Nobody else on that ship is going to die, even though there's going to be a shipwreck. Nobody's going to die because they're with Paul. That Paul's faith is going to get everybody through this mess. Now think about this. If God's presence is always with us, it means that the storms and the setbacks cannot separate us from the love of God. God's purpose is always in full work, and if God's purpose always is in full work, then the storms and setbacks cannot change God's purpose for our lives. That means I don't care what storm you're in right now, or what we've already gone through, or what we've got coming up, it's not going to change God's purpose for our lives. It's not going to change God's purpose for Westbury. And then remember that God's promises can be trusted. He says, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will all turn out just as God promised." Where is his faith? He doesn't have faith in the ship. He doesn't have faith in the pilot. He doesn't have faith in the soldiers. He doesn't even have faith in the boat. He says, "I have faith in God." He says, I want you to get this. He said, "I want you to know that God's going to take care of us. We're not going to die tonight, but the ship is going to go down." And they end up on the island of Malta. If you don't get anything else out of this lesson, please, please, please get this. Write this down. If you're in that storm right now, or you're about to go through that storm, God has not promised to save your ship, but he has promised to save you. You may lose your ship. Saving the ship is nowhere near as important as saving you. Acts chapter 27, 30 through 32 says, at one point, the sailors tried to abandon the ship thinking their lifeboat would save them. But Paul said, you'll all die unless you stay with this ship. So the soldiers cut the ropes and let go of their lifeboat. Okay. Here in the middle of this storm that's shredding their boat into toothpicks, they decide, we'll get this little dinky lifeboat and get out there. And Paul said, hold on. No. We stay in here together and we all live. And so they had to cut the lifeboat loose. And the problem is, they're thinking the lifeboat is going to save us, like the storm isn't going to hurt the lifeboat like it hurt the ship. On the other count, us, when it comes to us, and we're in our storm, and we're looking for our lifeboat, that a lot of us, it's taken our whole lives to build our lifeboat. Our whole lifeboats are our 401ks, or our 403bs. Our lifeboats are our retirement plans. Some of us, our lifeboats are the way we look. We spend a lot of money grooming to make sure we look good. We got enough height, weight, proportionate, and got all that kind of stuff. You know, they asked me the other day what I weighed, and I told them, and they said, how tall are you? I said 7'9", and it just seemed right on that. Some of us, it's that. Some of us, it's our mind. Man, I've got this academic mind, and I'm, that's what I pride myself on, and stuff like that. That's a lifeboat. And you know what? God doesn't honor the lifeboat. It can be taken away. You can't put your faith in something that can be taken away from you, which means you can't have security. So to have true security, you've got to put it in something that can't be taken away. Look, I'm sure you're a good person. I'm sure you're a nice person. But only Jesus can be your Savior. And for Jesus to save you, you've got to let go of the man-made lifeboat. Jesus can only save us when we abandon the ability of saving ourselves. I want you to notice what happens next. Acts 27, 34 through 36. It says, then Paul said, please eat something for your own good. And he took some bread, gave thanks to God before all of them, and he ate it. And then everyone was encouraged. Paul said, look, you guys have been fighting this stuff. Let's just stop and eat for a minute. And you'll be encouraged. And they got a little food in them. And Paul said, Paul blessed it, and now we come into the amazing comeback. In Acts chapter 27, verses 45 through 46, it says this: when daylight came, three marvelous words. Some of you guys are great sleepers. Some of you guys, you're asleep as soon as the head hits the pillow. I'm not a good sleeper. You know. I've got, the doctor gives me medicine that'll help me go to sleep. And if I'm not asleep by 2:30 in the morning, I take it. So I could at least get some sleep. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But nighttime is not a friend, because sometimes I just stay awake. And sometimes when you're in that and you can't get to sleep and you've read and all this kind of stuff, do you know what the most wonderful thing is? Daylight. I don't have to sit up and read and do all that stuff anymore. I can finally get up and get out of bed and do that. When daylight came, can I get really, really personal? Man, honestly, we've got some folks in here, you've been waiting for daylight your whole life. It's been nighttime your whole life. When daylight came, the officer ordered those who could swim to jump overboard to swim to the island. The rest grabbed pieces of wood from the broken ship to float on, and everyone made it safely to shore. Okay, that was a setback that turned into a comeback, didn't it? And everybody on that boat was saved because of Paul. Now, here's the thing that I really find amazing, that God wants to use us the same way he used Paul with the people that we associate with. God wants to use us the same way that he used Paul with the people in our lives who are fighting their way through storms right now, who are battling setbacks and battling suffering right now. God wants to use us like he used Paul. And right now, I dare you to let God use you like God used him. Paul didn't claim to do any miracles there. He just followed God. We have an invitation where we're going to offer anybody the opportunity to be baptized who has not been baptized into the blood of Jesus Christ. Don't worry, there's not blood back up there. It's just water. Romans chapter 6. That water that symbolizes a new birth. You got new blood running through your veins. To turn your setback into a comeback. That you take the pieces of your ship that have been crushed up and leave with the peace that passes understanding in Jesus Christ. That you take the wood of that cross and use it as something to get you to shore and to daylight. Be restored, replace membership, just belong. If you don't belong, you can leave here today belonging. We'll love you. And that's about all I need to say, except come while we stand and while we sing.
You call me out